Good afternoon and welcome back to the final session of the day. We started the day talking to private sector leaders about international cooperation and heard fairly positive assessments of the coordination on climate change policies and taxonomies, and also the importance of keeping financial markets open, providing investors with choice, even if essential local supervisory controls need to be in place for each jurisdiction. Now I hand to my colleague Henne Schuwer to introduce our panelists. You've spent, Henne, your whole career working on European and US diplomacy with the Dutch government, so there's no one better to steer a discussion on international coordination, our expectations, limitations, and priorities. So take it away, please, Henne.
Thank you very much, David. Yes, my name is Henne Schuwer. I'm a former Dutch diplomat who spent 17 years in Europe, 12 years in the US, and I have been asked and have the pleasure to moderate this special panel, which is a great pleasure for me after having left the United States in 2019 as ambassador of the Netherlands. And saying the United States reminds me, of course, that this panel takes place at an auspicious moment. We share the stage with POTUS, President Biden, as I was reminded this morning when I tried to reach Kreab's office at Rond-Point-Schuman, which was totally blocked off. So I'm back home in my own home, and we'll do it from here. I also am reminded that, of course, the EU, US and UK are the heart still of financial services. We have an EU-US forum in which we discuss things. We have hopefully very soon a UK-EU forum in which we discuss financial services. And there is, of course, an existing cooperation or a forum between the UK and the US. I've also learned that how difficult and how intricate the financial services and the whole complex of financial relations are between those three countries, between these three entities. So I'm very happy to have an expert panel to whom I can give the floor in a second. They are John Berrigan, Director General FISMA of the Commission, Katharine, Braddick, Director General Financial Services of the UK Treasury, and Sharon, Deputy Assistant Secretary at the US Department of Treasury. They are regulators. They are the ones who will connect the policy with the regulation. We live, luckily, in democracies where the rule of law is prevalent. They make the rules that will decide what's going to happen in the coming years. So it's very interesting to talk to them, to see what the rules will be. We know a little bit of the EU will go on the green axis, we will go on the digital axis, we will try to do something for the SMEs, wondering if that would be the same for the US and the UK. I personally have the impression that our goals might be very, very similar. The path that we take to reach this goal, they might differ a little bit. So we'll try in this panel to discover a little bit what are the convergences and the divergences that we will do in the next coming years in our policy. Before I will give the floor to the panel for their introductory statements, I want to point out that we have a question for you. A question, is, if I'm told rightly, will be on the right-hand side of your screen, which says, are the existing bilateral forums for financial services dialogues a sufficient basis for effective cooperation and coordination? It's a yes or no question. I would like to ask you to make your choice, yes or no, and we'll see the result after the introduction of the panelists, and then we'll go into a question and answer session with the public, and you can base your question and answers among other things, on the result of your yes and no question. So I would like to give the floor first to John Berrigan, as I said, Director General of FISMA. John, can I have your introduction, please?
Okay, thank you very, thank you very much, Henne, and good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are. Henne, I'm not sure I fully recognize myself in your introduction, at least me anyway, but it's still very nice to be here to discuss with Katharine and Sharon and have the opportunity to maybe share a few of my thoughts and the Commission's thoughts on aspects of international cooperation in financial services. I think the discussion, as you mentioned, is quite timely. I mean, the world continues to grapple with the COVID crisis. The geopolitical environment has changed in some significant respects recently. And all of these developments have implications for the EU and its interactions with other jurisdictions, both bilaterally and multilaterally. What I can say from the outset is that the EU remains open to the rest of the world, as open as ever, and continues to advocate multilateralism and a rule-based global governance system. I think this rules-based governance model has demonstrated its worth again during the ongoing COVID crisis, where I think global cooperation, certainly in the financial services field, has been very strong. This financial sector wasn't, of course, at the center of the crisis, but there was an episode of pressure in March 2020. And I think the international response to that was swift, it was coordinated, and it confirmed, at least for me, that we had learned the lessons from the great financial crisis 10 years earlier. Now, since March 2020, things have been quieter in the financial system, but bodies like the FSB and the Basel Committee and other standard setters have continued to meet regularly to exchange information and to ensure that we continue to have a coordinated response to ongoing developments, and they will continue to meet in the future, I believe, to ensure a kind of equally coordinated response to any issues that might emerge as we begin to exit from the crisis, albeit, I guess, at different speeds in different parts of the world. So I think for the EU, as for all jurisdictions, we have good reason to remain strongly engaged and committed to the work being undertaken in these international fora. I think more generally, the EU's commitment to multilateralism and international cooperation is reflected in our financial services regulation, which is heavily influenced by global principles and standards, again, coming from bodies such as the FSB, Basel, IOSCO, etc. And of course, like others, we have to be mindful of our so-called EU specificities when applying these principles and standards, but we try to address our specificities in a way that doesn't compromise our international obligations or our efforts to promote, well-functioning international financial markets. And then this brings me to the issue of financial fragmentation, which I guess is one of the genuine concerns that people have, and many of you have listening today, and probably lies behind the question in your poll. Now, I guess most of us attending this conference would like to have a global financial system which is as integrated as possible or as little fragmented as possible. We know that fragmentation can have detrimental effects, reduces competition, higher cost of capital, less available services, etc. And all of these reduce the efficiency of the system. And we try to address this fragmentation at our level here in the policy world by means of regulatory cooperation, both multilateral and bilateral, which I'll come to in a minute. But I think there are some unavoidable sources of fragmentation which cannot be addressed just by regulatory cooperation, no matter how deep or intense that may be. And I'm sure those who have listened to me before will know that I have said this before. And typically, these sources of unavoidable fragmentation relate to the ultimate responsibility for preserving financial stability, which remains at jurisdictional level, so long as we don't have global government and global taxpayers, etc. So there can be legitimate trade-offs, I think, between ensuring and promoting global financial integration on the one hand, and then safeguarding financial stability at jurisdictional level on the other. Now, to an extent, these trade-offs can be met through even more intensive regulatory and supervisory cooperation to manage that cross-border stability risk. And that should be the objective. But even here, I think there are limits if the stability risks from integration are deemed to be too high. Because in the end, it's not just a question of international cooperation, but it's also a question of accountability at the jurisdictional level. And this is not just in good times when cooperation is generally fairly plain sailing, but it's also in the not so good times when, as we've seen even now in the most recent experience of the COVID crisis, even the most established cooperative arrangements can come under heavy stress. So in short, my message today is that the EU remains fully committed to global financial integration based on international principles and standards, but the EU must also ensure that this commitment is somehow consistent with its responsibilities to safeguard financial stability within its own jurisdiction. And in that sense, I guess we would not differ from any other jurisdiction, although I will admit the appreciation of the risks involved might differ among us. If I can now maybe go on just to say a few words about our bilateral relations, particularly with the United Kingdom and the US, both of whom are represented here today. I think we start with the UK. There, the challenge of reconciling the benefits of integration and safeguarding financial stability for the EU has become somewhat more complicated after Brexit. In the 40 years or so before Brexit, the City of London, of course, had emerged not only as a great global financial centre, but also as Europe's primary financial centre, the financial centre of the EU. And that means that after the UK's exit, the EU finds itself with much of its domestic financial system and the associated risk still in the City of London, but outside of its jurisdiction. Now, this shift from intra-jurisdictional to extra-jurisdictional risk management has implications for that trade-off between integration and stability that I mentioned earlier. We're in a period of adjustment now when I think both the EU and the UK are trying to work out our future relations in financial services. These relations will depend, I think, on how we perceive the future, and more specifically, how far our two jurisdictions might move away from the nearly full alignment in rules that has characterized the period until very recently. So in that sense, I suppose we see Brexit as a politically fragmenting event, which may have unavoidable fragmenting consequences in financial services. But let's see, we should strive for good regulatory cooperation based on mutual confidence, while retaining autonomy, of course, over our respective rules. I think neither side wants to be, and indeed neither side needs to be, a rule taker in this relationship, and we can manage that, I believe. Now, the framework for managing the EU-UK financial relations going forward will largely replicate what we have in place for the EU-US relations. That's a regulatory dialogue based on an MOU. We've had this arrangement in place with the US since 2003, but I think it has become more productive, more efficient, let's say, as a source of engagement in more recent years. And we have two formal meetings of the forum each year, but to be honest, most of the heavy lifting takes place between those forum meetings in working groups, etc., where the real work is done and where people like me don't sit. I just sit on the forum and take credit for all the work that's been done before. I can't speak for Sharon, but we're certainly happy with the arrangement and we want to build on it further. And it has worked well, I have to say, irrespective of what administration has been in place. But looking forward now, we have to admit that there have been important change in priorities with the incoming Biden administration. And the one I want to mention here, which I think was discussed in the previous session, is of course in the area of climate change, and more specifically in our world, in the area of sustainable finance. And so I'll just spend a couple of minutes before I finish on sustainable finance. I think given the scale of the climate challenge, sustainable finance has to move center stage now in the global financial agenda. That's understood. The EU is relatively advanced, I think, in its sustainable finance policies. Our experience tells us that policymakers and regulators need to provide the private sector with credible and usable tools and frameworks to set the path for transition to sustainable development. And that's why we are determined to put in place the taxonomy, develop necessary disclosure tools, a regime, I should say, and provide investors with the instruments and tools that they need to navigate around the sustainable finance world. We're very happy and very much welcome that other jurisdictions are also taking their own actions, notably in the US and the UK. And we also welcome the work that the FSB is doing, stepping up to coordinate the myriad of international work streams in the area of sustainable finance. I think all of these efforts are, again, important to limit the risks of fragmentation that we discussed earlier. But any international principles and standards must be sufficiently ambitious. If they're not, I mean, the EU, of course, will support them fully as minimum benchmarks, but we will not feel constrained by them and not feel prevented from going beyond. Hopefully others will follow us. Because the litmus test for us of coordinated sustainable finance policies won't be that they avoid financial fragmentation. It must be that they are at least consistent with achieving the 2050 climate targets and indeed other ESG objectives. So again, we're going to be very supportive of international efforts here, but we'll hope that they will be sufficiently ambitious to meet the targets that have been set for us by policymakers in other fields. Henne, I'm going to stop here. I think I've probably gone over my 10 minutes, but apologize for that. But I'll stop, and I look forward to hearing from Katharine and Sharon. Thank you.
Henne, you're on mute.
So you get the seal of approval. Thank you very much. And thank you for a very wide-ranging look on the future of financial services seen from the EU. And thank you for doing it in 10 minutes. I want to give the floor to Katharine. Katharine Braddick, please.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Henne, and thank you very much for inviting me today. And it's great to see Sharon and Sharon in this context. So I'm going to start my remarks by focusing on the two of the areas where, for us, the question of international cooperation is currently particularly apposite, perhaps particularly important. They're both issues that have been picked up already in the course of the conference today. The first is climate, where I think you had a very productive discussion this morning, and Sharon was just speaking very clearly about the importance of climate as a mutual concern around which we need to be closely cooperating and in close dialogue. Each of us has our own path in our own jurisdiction towards our net zero goals, but we all know that we can't fund those from within our own jurisdictions. We need deep, mobile, internationally mobile pools of liquidity to support the transition to net zero economies and to create the carbon neutral economies of the future. The arrival of the United States in that discussion, as Sharon indicated, is both incredibly important and very, very welcome. It greatly enhances our chances of getting to those goals and the timescales that we all envisage. And it generates some kind of high quality challenges because we all have different legal systems. Our business models are in different places, in different jurisdictions. And we also, in thinking about, for example, what would count as a green asset within the region of Europe, that looks quite different than it would if you're in another part of the globe. So we have a mixture of idiosyncrasies, but we have an important shared goal that we will only achieve together. And what's important is that those who are further ahead don't feel that they have to slacken pace in order for us to find that convergence. It's important that we don't have a kind of deficit focus around the issues that we find difficult. And dialogue between the jurisdictions represented here and in the multilateral fora are going to be critically important, particularly in this moment now where we are establishing the market practices and norms that will enable investment to be released for net zero purposes. And from the UK's perspective, currently as president of the G7 and our role in COP26, we're very acutely aware of that. And personally, I think the communique language around, for example, disclosures was really important that was achieved at the recent summit. Our success in this area is going to be judged by the economic effectiveness of our move towards net zero. And I think this is an area where financial services regulation and its objectives and public policy objectives are unusually visibly close. And I think that's going to be a good discipline for all of us in focusing on the importance of that continuing dialogue. The other area where this kind of collaboration is particularly current and important is technology. That won't surprise anyone to hear. I know there was a very lively discussion around central bank digital currency earlier today. it's a bit different from climate, because I think that originally, I mean, for us, certainly in the UK, what we originally referred to as fintech was quite substantially a domestic policy discussion for quite some time. The innovation that we saw was very extensive in payments and very extensively focused on retail markets and consumers. And that is typically a sort of domestic jurisdictional concern rather than one for deep cross-border cooperation. But that's less and less true as technology enters more and more areas of financial services. The emergence of crypto assets and stable coins is one of the developments that has really disrupted that approach, and that's because those innovations in themselves are intended to, if you like, elide the boundaries between jurisdictions. And so it's important that we are always engaging with each other on how we are both experiencing the uptake of these innovations and also the risks that we see and how they're being addressed, because they can travel. But I think perhaps the most, what feels like the most currently discussed area of this collaboration is around central bank digital currency. And I think that is certainly an area where we have really good cooperation, certainly between the central banks represented on this panel and among some of our other developed economy counterparts. Given the importance of the emergence of central bank digital currencies, it's really critical that those institutions are pushing ahead the intellectual understanding and the use case discussion for that innovation, so that its effect on the global system is well understood in advance of the development of a CBDC. I'm not, of course, going to pretend that Brexit is irrelevant here. Our departure from the European Union, our closest trading partner, inevitably is a quite substantial shift in our engagement with that trading partner. And it's no secret that we didn't get the deal we'd hoped to on financial services. We'd hoped to have quite comprehensive findings of equivalence between our two jurisdictions. But the industry was well prepared for that outcome. Our supervisors engage closely, and we did not see major financial stability issues arising. I think we now, obviously, there's a lot of discussion and debate and speculation about the approach that we will take in the UK to our rule book. And we've tried to be as transparent as possible about the areas where we think that we do need to look at regulation and make it work a bit better for the UK market. And that is, to absolutely nobody's surprise, Solvency II, where our concerns around margining and the matching adjustment are of long standing. We've talked about a review of wholesale markets regulation, which again is not surprising given the scale of capital markets activity in the UK. And indeed, earlier this year, we announced some changes to listings that actually, frankly, we could have made when we were in the European Union. And quite a lot of that change is actually to keep up with developments in European Union member states, where we've seen some divergence arise between them and the UK approach. There's a lot of debate about focus and direction there, and we keep saying that it's not a race to the bottom, and we don't see and are not being asked for a massive sort of slash and burn of regulation. I think perhaps the best way to sort of think about the way we are thinking about those changes is to recognise what has not changed in the UK in terms of financial services policy making. We have a large international financial services sector in the UK that continues to be both an asset to our economy and to present risks to our economy, risks that we felt acutely during the financial crisis. It continues to be the case that both those opportunities and those risks can only be effectively harnessed and managed through cooperation with our counterparts and through a multilateral system and through a strong system of international harmonization around standards for cross-border trade. That was the case 5 years ago, it was the case 8 years ago, and it's the case now. And as Sharon says, I think the recent experience in COVID shows both what that system has delivered in terms of improving the security of the system and what it was capable of delivering in the course of last year when we were dealing with the first throes of the pandemic. So in terms of the future of our cooperation, we know our EU counterparts well. We do across all the institutions, and we hope to be able to progress soon with our sort of steady state dialogue arrangements, which as Sean says, will be familiar to anybody who knows the EU-US structure for engagement. We also have excellent engagement with our United States counterparts, and in recent years have invested a good deal in the establishment and development of our financial regulation working group, which met quite recently on the US side under Sharon's leadership, where I think we are now at a stage of, from my perspective, having really constructive, deep, engaged discussions around indeed some of the issues I've just been talking about. And finally, we continue to invest very heavily in the international standard setters, because I think, as I hope I've made clear, from the perspective of the UK's management of its own risk and own economic well-being, and to address the issues that finance both presents and needs to solve for all of our jurisdictions, those international standard setters are going to continue to be absolutely critical. I think I also probably may have overrun my time, so I will draw to a close there. Thank you.
No, Katharine, I think it's a draw between you and Sean. You were both perfectly on time. Thank you very, very much.
Very diplomatic of both of us.
Yes, disciplined people. Now we're going to see if Sharon is as disciplined as you all are. So please, Sharon, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, Henne. Both Sean and Katharine have set high bars here, and thank you for inviting me to participate in this conference and at this panel. As colleagues have heard, I have the good fortune of engaging quite frequently with Sean and Katharine on these important issues through our financial regulatory dialogues and our multilateral engagements, particularly through the Financial Stability Board. And I look forward to being able to engage, hopefully in person soon. So while the main focus of today's discussion is financial sector, I'd like to start by emphasizing really the importance of the strong transatlantic partnership that we share with both the EU and the UK. Our shared foundational values, strong ties in areas like trade, investment, defense, and firm commitment to cooperation make the US-EU and the US-UK relationships of critical bilateral and I think global significance. Indeed, as Henne, you mentioned, President Biden's first overseas trip was to the UK and Belgium, where he participated in both the G7 and the NATO summits. And while in the UK, President Biden also held the US-UK summit with Prime Minister Johnson, and the two leaders affirmed the special relationship and set out a global vision in a new Atlantic Charter to really further deepen the cooperation on a range of areas. And the US-EU summit, of course, takes place today, where President Biden and European Union leaders will focus on stimulating the global recovery, tackling climate change, and aligning our approaches to trade and technology so that democracies are writing the rules for them as we move deeper into the 21st century. I think the location of a new president's first trip abroad sends a strong signal about his or her priorities. And this trip really highlighted President Biden's commitment to our alliances, revitalizing our transatlantic relationships, and to working close cooperation with our allies and multilateral partners to address global challenges. So I'll touch briefly on some of these global challenges, because I think these will be the very policy issues that will require enhanced global cooperation and partnership with the EU, the UK, and others as well as we push forward these priorities. Not surprisingly, several of these will be ones that both Sean and Katharine have touched on already. One, recovery from the pandemic. Two, tackling climate change. And third, bolstering global financial stability writ large. Just briefly on the pandemic, I'm glad to say that the robust US vaccination campaign is moving us closer to a return to more normal economic activity in the US. And it's helping to unleash pent-up demand while additional fiscal support from the American Rescue Plan continues to to really boost the U.S. economy. At the same time, Secretary Yellen has noted that ending the pandemic gives us an opportunity to shape our recovery and tackle our most pressing social economic challenges. And that's why the president has proposed the American Jobs Plan and the American Families Plan, whose policy will promote a dynamic recovery with greater opportunity for workers, higher living standards, and over time, reduce inequality. On climate change, which has been an important topic of this conference, and my colleagues have mentioned already, we, with the end of the pandemic, I think it's also an opportunity for the U.S. to really tackle climate change. And as folks know, it really is a priority issue for the Biden-Harris administration. And Secretary Yellen has referred to it as an existential threat, really, that poses systemic risk to the U.S. economy. To be clear, the flip side of this challenge, we see it as a historic opportunity from an economic perspective to reorient our industries and economies to a clean and sustainable pathway. As Sean mentioned, the importance of us joining both the UK and the EU and committing to net zero by 2050. And just briefly highlighting where we're moving on this front. One, in terms of managing climate-related financial risk, you may have seen a recent executive order that calls on a whole-of-government approach to analyze and mitigate climate risk to the financial system, homeowners, consumers, businesses, and the federal government programs and facilities. The Financial Stability Oversight Council, or FSOC, which the Secretary chairs, is helping to coordinate our regulators' collective efforts to improve both the measurement and the management of climate-related risks to the financial system. Our Federal Reserve colleagues are working to better understand both the financial stability implications as well as incorporate climate-related financial risks to its thinking from the supervisory and regulatory front. And with the G7 commitment that we're happy to support in terms of disclosures, giving investors the consistent, comparable, and decision useful information they need to compare climate-related risks and opportunities around companies, across companies, is also a priority here, where the SEC is reviewing its 2010 guidance on climate-related financial disclosures. Third, really taking a whole-of-government approach to climate. At Treasury, we've established a climate hub with a new climate counselor that will be coordinating our efforts across Treasury and run point also with our counterparts internationally. And the American Jobs Plan, which really is the cornerstone of the administration's Building Back Better approach, and will be the most significant public investment in America since the 60s. It includes you may have seen a significant climate investment in green infrastructure, like clean power generation, electric vehicles and charging stations, retrofitting U.S. buildings to be more sustainable, and the like. And of course, we're working internationally to address this global challenge, including the G20, where I have the privilege of co-chairing the newly reinstated Sustainable Finance Working Group. And in the G7, where we are very happy to support the UK on their ambitious climate-related agenda. So third, on financial stability, I will just briefly touch on some of the FSOC priorities that Secretary Yellen has developed with our regulatory colleagues. One on open-ended funds and looking at non-bank financial and intermediation. Two, on money market fund reform, and third, on assessing potential vulnerabilities in U.S. Treasury securities markets. Now turning quickly to, I think, the focus of this discussion in terms of U.S., EU, UK financial regulatory cooperation. I really think the future of our financial services relationships and how we can take that relationship forward really needs to be based on the principles that I think both Katharine and Sean have mentioned in terms of openness, financial market integration, and of course, competition. And we're very fortunate to enjoy such strong relationships with both our EU and our UK colleagues, collaborating in all of these policy areas that I've just mentioned. I will note that we, of course, very much support the EU's efforts to build a stronger banking union and a capital markets union based on the tenets of openness, support for competition, and choice. And the UK's efforts to launch a new chapter for its financial services industry that bolsters the dynamic nature, openness, and competitiveness of financial services sector. I will be honest, however, that it's likely that there will be new challenges, not surprisingly, in light of the UK's withdrawal from the European Union, and that those challenges may have implications for financial sectors outside of the EU and the UK. And throughout the Brexit process, we in the United States have really focused on mitigating potential financial stability issues that may come out of the separation. And to the great credit, I think, of the EU and UK financial authorities and the firms in the private sector as well, there do seem to have been limited financial stability impacts. And going forward, the question of how we manage the differences between our regulatory regimes and enhance the competitiveness of our respective financial markets, I think really comes down to two things in my view, which I think we've all touched on already today. One, a multilateral approach where appropriate, and the role of international standards where we can, which really allows us to row in generally the same direction, of course, as we pursue our shared prudential objectives and mitigate regulatory arbitrage and market fragmentation. And we remain very committed to robust engagement in multilateral organizations, such as the G7, G20, and the Financial Stability Board, and other venues where these standards and policy objectives are discussed and addressed. And second, of course, our ability to continue bilateral cross-border regulatory and supervisory cooperation to really reduce regulatory frictions and enhance the safety and soundness of our respective financial systems. So as I mentioned, we're very fortunate to have strong regulatory cooperation with both the EU and the UK, and we have held both of our financial regulatory dialogues in this new administration, and look forward to continuing those strong relationships as we move forward. And I see that my time is also up, so I'll stop here, and I'm very much looking forward to the discussion today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sharon. I must say, in all honesty, I declare you the winner. Still, I think you were the...
It's not a competition.
No, it's not a competition, of course. No. Thank you very much. Yeah, and thank you very much for all three panelists for very enlightening presentations. The poll results have come up, which is interesting, which shows that 58% roughly of the audience doesn't think that the existing financial services dialogues are sufficient basis for effective cooperation. Only 42% think so, which is interesting. How would you solve this? Let's say if this is a genuine worry that is existing, would you think that a trilateral forum where all three of you, three entities would participate, would that be a solution? Or how would you solve the problem posed by the answer to the poll question?
Henne, sorry, just to interrupt very quickly before we go on. It was actually the other way around. So 58% of people thought that the bilateral forums were sufficient. And
okay. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm reading it wrong.
No
don't worry. You're doing great.
No problem. Okay.
Okay. I'm sorry. Not to worry. Then I have another question for you, which is from my more or less political background. You see now the president having been in Europe for 4 or 5 days. There is one constant in all his meetings, both in Cornwall as at the NATO, as today with the EU, which is the upcoming role of China. Do you think, let's say, up till now, you three entities more or less are the ones who set the standards, who make the regulation for the global financial services market. China is an upcoming entity. You have the digital yuan coming up. Do you think that at a certain moment you have to think about China, you have to do something about China. Is there any talk among the three of you about that? I would be interested.
Should I kick off, and then Sharon and Sean no doubt will want to come in as well. So on financial services in particular, we've had a long-standing set of relationships with the Chinese authorities, and early on in their process of opening up in terms of their financial system, we worked closely with them on the internationalization of the renminbi, and it's still our goal and objective in policy terms to find ways to foster trade between the UK and China on financial services. And my experience of doing that is that, as with all jurisdictions in talking about FS trade, it's deeply a regulatory discussion. It is deeply a regulatory discussion about standards and norms and expectation and information and disclosure. And that in itself is a very important discussion to help jurisdictions understand each other, to normalize certain ideas and approaches. We continue to take that approach in the UK and through our through our people who work in China to foster the presence of UK firms in China, and indeed to try to attract Chinese business to the UK. So I can't see any world in which that's not relevant. And I would add that, to go back to what I was saying on tech, a lot of the Chinese experience is really compelling because they leapt ahead of developments in what you could still refer to, I suppose, as the West, in terms of the way technology is being used for payments and in other ways in their markets. And we have a massive amount to learn from looking at consumer behavior, looking at market behavior through their tech adoption. And that's, I think it's important for, I think this is true in the G20 context and the FSB, for us broadly to be always attentive to what is going on in the jurisdictions of our Asian counterparts, because particularly in the world of technology, in some respects, they are ahead of us.
Sharon, Sean?
Sure, I can just jump in. Just to build on some of Katharine's remarks, I will say, I'll start by saying that increasing involvement for a range of jurisdictions in policy areas like sustainable finance, I think, would be a welcome development, of course, and something that we would be encouraging to ensure that our efforts here can really be maximized in addressing climate change. And in fact, we're working very collaboratively with our PBOC G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group co-chair, along with, of course, the Italian presidency and UNDP Secretariat. You know, on the broader question, there is general global appreciation, I think, of the value created by international financial regulatory standards and cooperation, including in multilateral forums, as Katharine mentioned, in the FSB. And including, the role of maintaining safety and soundness goals that we all share, minimizing fragmentation and promoting a level playing field. And really, I think, providing a baseline for trust, cooperation, and more integration. So coupled with this general appreciation is the recognition that our financial sectors are large and sophisticated and open to the world. And EU, UK, and the US, I think we very much operate based on the rule of law, and our regulators and supervisors are independent and on the cutting edge of regulatory and supervisory issues. So I think this regulatory clarity, transparency, foundation on the rule of law, and true openness to kind of international trade and investment are the key drivers of increased currency usage and financial sector depth. And so just some additional thoughts from me. Thank you.
Sean?
Yeah, thanks, Hannah. I mean, the first thing I would say is that this process of the sort of globalization of the financial sector started some time ago. It started after the great financial crisis. It was with the emergence of the G20 process itself. So I think this is not something we have not seen and is news. And in that context, China has been emerging over time. So I think it's why I think EU, US, UK are as committed to the G20 as we are, because we recognize that there is a sort of multilateralization of the financial system, which has been going on for quite a while. Of course, we all have our respective dialogues with China. I have to say ours is not as deep as they are with the US and will be with the UK when we get going, but it is developing, I think, more and more as we have these. We are finding more and more issues that we need to discuss together, ranging from issues even around central clearing right across to accounting. There's a whole bunch of issues emerging. And I think what Katharine said about digitalization is important, because with digitalization of the system, China will not just close that gap, because as she said, in some cases already ahead. And so there's a sort of issue here that as we all digitalize, this balance will shift. So I do tend to agree that perhaps the days when the three jurisdictions represented around this table could just sit around and make the rules for the rest of the world may no longer last for very much longer. And that's why I think it's important that we engage with China, not just bilaterally, but also multilaterally, because it's very important that what we agree as international standards together are applied as international standards together. And that's where I think we need to be a little bit strong, because if we are all part of international organizations and we all agree on international standards, it's very important that countries who maybe in the past didn't think these standards really apply to them because they were not so developed realize, in fact, they are now quite developed, and that those standards should now apply to all of us. And we may need to think a little bit about implementation as much as just agreement on international standards going forward.
Okay, thank you very much. I have a question here from the audience, Mr. Schickler, who asked on the global banking rules, what are your views on the parallel capital stack the EU is considering? What are the consequences if it breaks the Basel Agreement? Any thoughts?
I think I can pass on that one.
Somebody said happily, yes.
I mean, I think also, in a sense, I should also pass in that the EU's rulemaking is its business. I mean, as Sean said, we're all committed to Basel and the G20 standards and need to deliver them. And that's what we're doing in the UK. And I'm sure that's what he and his colleagues are looking at doing in the EU. I think it's, I think all three of us represented on this call get a lot of incoming from banks about the effects of capital standards and differing capital standards, not just in quantum, but in approach, because that can impose costs. And I think it is incumbent on all of us to think about that quite carefully. But, right at the beginning in his remarks, Sean said that it's important for, fundamentally, however converged your international standards are, when it comes to risk, that is for a jurisdiction to deal with and to back, and that's where the capital standards come into play. I think it's, and as Sean said, I mean, it's all important that we adhere to the standards we've committed to.
Sharon, you have any comments?
I think my my comments would be, not surprisingly, very similar to Katharine's. You've heard us, all three jurisdictions, I think, very much support multilateral processes and engagements and international standards, and it allow us to generally, again, row in the same direction as we share prudential safeguards and similar policy objectives, and then we do in turn respect kind of domestic jurisdictions' ability to translate that in a way that makes sense for the risk to their own jurisdictions.
Okay, thank you.
I mean, maybe I shouldn't pass in time.
Yes, sure. Go ahead.
Since it was probably meant for me anyway. Thanks, Jack. What we're trying to do is implement Basel. I mean, we are not going to come forward, and of course we are considering different ways of approaching this, but we're not going to come forward with anything that is not compliant with Basel. Okay, so we are looking. There are different ways you can interpret, and different ways you can implement the standards that have been agreed. But of course, our intention would never be to implement this in a way which was kind of knowingly not compliant.
Okay. I have another question. After the global financial crisis, about 10 years ago now, a bit longer, you set up a number of rules and regulations. Now we're getting out of the COVID economic crisis. Are there things that need to be changed of the existing financial framework made after the global financial crisis? And if so, what are the most urgent things that you think have to be changed in view of dealing with the economic crisis after COVID?
So I don't mind saying a bit about that from the UK perspective. I think the first thing to say is that the prudential reform that followed the financial crisis is what enabled the system to withstand what occurred last year and to continue to support all our economies. And I think that's really important, and we need to keep reiterating it. We did learn some new things, and we saw some pressure around the operation of non-bank finance, and there's a lot of active work going on, in particular around the events of last March. So we can all between us consider what action might be required there. One of the results of banking reform was that we saw a lot of assets shift into the non-bank financial system, and more broadly, there's a story there about needing to scrutinise that and understand the risks better. Those are all important for the UK. I think the thing I would add that is domestic for us and may not apply, I think, so much for the other jurisdictions on this panel is I think we need to think about the role of patient capital and long-term asset funds in the UK as a way of supporting our economy in any case. It was required in any case, but as we move out of the COVID crisis and given the government's goals for infrastructure and levelling up, trying to ensure the most effective sort of context circumstances for that investment in the UK is a really important part of our policy agenda. We're doing a lot of work around that.
Thank you. Sharon?
Sure. So I would echo Katharine's comment here that thankfully, I think the COVID crisis proved that many of our global financial crisis reforms worked well, and banks really did come through and were a source of strength here. We are taking a look at several of the market turmoil issues that seem to highlight vulnerabilities in certain parts of the non-bank financial intermediation sector, which I also touched on in my opening remarks. And we are actively exchanging views, not just bilaterally, but also multi-forum, to examine the sector and also generally if there are any lessons learned from the COVID crisis and the market turmoil. One thing that I will touch on, obviously this is not a new issue, and both Katharine and Sean have mentioned digitalization and financial technology, but I do think that with COVID and the increased use of remote work and learning and technology and digital payments, et cetera, has really brought to the fore what was an accelerated, I think, an issue that was already prominent. So I think we'll see more of that acceleration across a wide swath of the economy, obviously including financial services. So maybe those two things to note.
Thank you. Sean?
Yeah, I mean, I will just echo what has been said. I mean, I think the work that was done after the global financial crisis seemed to stand us in good stead, I think, at the beginning of this crisis. As I said, the financial sector wasn't part of the problem, which in itself would seem to suggest that we got something right around there. For my sins, of course, we are in the Union have opened up all the 5 main pillars of our post-crisis reform, but that's largely due to legislative requirements. But we will open up the capital requirements, MiFID, Solvency II, the AFMD, the BRD, but these will be evolutionary changes. They will not be any sort of radical changes. They're sort of what you expect on your sort of 3 to 5 year maintenance that you have to do to just take account of how the system has evolved. So nothing revolutionary there. In terms of things we might have missed, I suppose one issue is about the use of capital buffers, which didn't work as well as we might have hoped in the crisis. So there's a lot of work being done there. Let's see what they come up with. I'm not sure this is the most typical cycle that we've ever had, but we did learn something that they didn't seem to work as we expected. As Katharine said, the non-banking financial sector, we had it on our radar before the COVID crisis. It remains on our radar now afterwards, perhaps even more so. And then, of course, we in the EU, as Sharon has mentioned, have our own sort of domestic agenda around banking union, CMU, anti-money laundering, all the things which we need to make pretty rapid progress on going forward.
Okay, thank you very much. I want to look ahead a little bit to COP26. We have talked quite a lot about sustainable finance, the Green Deal. Do you expect, hope for any concrete commitments impacting climate finance coming out of Glasgow COP26?
I think there are a number of things we could hope to see coming out of COP26 and that we're working towards. I think we feel from the UK perspective that one of the things we can bring to this, as leaders of this particular process is putting finance right in the centre of what we're all trying to achieve. And there are a number of ways we might do that through fostering structures for finance ministers to engage through COP26. Mark Carney is the Prime Minister's advisor and of course previously governor of our central bank, has been doing a lot of work to galvanise the kind of private sector component of this. So I think there are multiple aspects of the COP agenda can be usefully informed and progressed through the finance lens. As I've said, I think from the UK perspective certainly, but also I know in discussions that all of us are in the multilateral fora, it's really about establishing the norms for consistent, reliable pricing information throughout the product distribution chain. And if we achieve that, we will achieve the markets that will help us get there.
Okay. Sharon, the Americans are chairing one of the working groups now. You have taken over the working groups on the Green Deal, so to say.
So yes, we are privileged to be co-chairing the G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group. So I actually co-chair that with PBOC colleague Ma Jun. And we actually have our second meeting coming up later this week. Just broadly on the G20 agenda, one, it was elevated, I think, from a study group to a working group, in part because just the recognition of the G20 membership of the importance, of course, of this issue, and really allows us to do a little bit more policy thinking on the path forward for the G20. As I mentioned in my opening remarks, one of the main deliverables is going to be a G20 roadmap, and that will basically show kind of existing work that is ongoing in international forum and also with our bilateral counterparts. The idea is, of course, not to duplicate any of that work, but to really leverage it, enhance it, accelerate it where we can, and provide a direction of travel for the G20 in terms of path forward on several issues for sustainable finance. We'll also be delivering in 2021 reports to finance ministers and central bank governors around information and data, which Katharine mentioned is so fundamental to really, I think, a building block for all of our climate-related policies. And two, on mobilizing and accelerating MDB finance, which in addition to direct financing really provides an enabling environment, I think, for private sector finance. And third, we'll be looking at different ways to enhance interoperability and comparability of mechanisms and tools to better facilitate and accelerate climate-aligned finance. And taxonomy may be one option, but there are several other metrics and frameworks that we're taking a look at as well. So that's a brief overview of the G20 SFWG agenda for this year.
Okay, thanks. I think I have one last question, one which is also a bit personal because I never understood it, and that's the word open strategic autonomy. Launched very popular now in the European Union. I have never understood what it actually means, or I have heard various explanations what it means. I would like to ask Sean, you mentioned that also in your financial services. What does it mean, and what is more important, autonomy or openness?
Well, I suppose I could be kind of tautologist here and say that they're both equally important, otherwise we wouldn't have put them in. I think what's important to understand here is that this is not about disengaging. This is about staying engaged, but getting engaged on a slightly different basis. That's all. And what, this has been, of course, presented by the media as the Europe trying to flex its muscles around the world and demonstrate it's strategically autonomous. It is actually quite the contrary. It's about Europe looking at itself and realizing it has vulnerabilities in the system, and these vulnerabilities need to be assessed and addressed. If you look at us as one of the largest economic blocs in the world, on some metrics, the largest economic bloc in the world, and then you look at how developed our financial system is around that bloc, we look relatively underdeveloped, let's say, compared to other economies. And that has opened up these ideas, these possibilities of strategic vulnerabilities that we have identified in the piece. So it is not that we're trying to sort of throw our weight around. In fact, it's quite the contrary, where we're trying to recognize the fact that in some areas we have these vulnerabilities. And you only have to look at our most recent experience of vaccinations and the pandemic and the issues of supply chain that have emerged there to realize that this is a more general discussion. It's not one necessarily confined to Europe. We're just the ones talking about it. I think many other parts of the world are now thinking about it. We just put it down. That we have to think about not disengaging, but understanding whether or not the way in which we are engaging with the world is one which is sustainable from our perspective. And if it's not sustainable from our perspective, then by, again, tautology, it's not going to be sustainable from anybody else's perspective either. So we're trying to, and that's where the open and autonomy comes in. We're trying to remain engaged, but be engaged on the basis that is sustainable going forward. And I think if we get that right, then you'll find that Europe is an even more open partner than it has been in the past.
Wonderful. Should be a politician. No, but it's a very nice, it's a good explanation, and
I will pass.
But you'll pass.
Can I just say
comments of Katharine and Sharon before we close on this item? Okay, then I would like to close. Thank you very, very much. It's been the most interesting discussion. Thank you for your participation. I, for one, who is a non. I won't say non-believer, but somebody who is involved with financial services. I learned a lot, and it was very, very interesting. So thank you very much for your wisdom and your involvement. And I would like to give it back to Dan and David, who will close out the day. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
So thank you very much. It's just our task now to just thank all the panelists again. I know, Sean, I thought perhaps you wanted to say something. Oh, okay. You said you might. Okay, we'll round up the discussion, but thank you all again. There is a networking opportunity to continue the discussion, and Dan will outline that, but I'll hand back to Dan to close the conference. Thank you all for your participation, your questions, and your contributions.
Thank you, David. And I'd like to say a big thank you from my side to all of our panelists in that session, and of course, all of our panelists and speakers throughout the duration of the event today. So we've had some really fascinating discussions on some quite varied issues, and we really do appreciate all of their time, efforts, and contributions, both on the day today, but also in the preparation beforehand. So it all really is appreciated, and I hope everybody out there has enjoyed those discussions and found them as interesting and as useful as we all have here. A big thank you as well to all of our event partners, so to Barclays, to Generali, and of course, David, to yourself and to your colleagues at Kreab for all the work that has gone into this year's events. And also a big thank you as well to our supporting partners for the event, so to BNP Paribas Fortis, to London Stock Exchange Group, and to Bloomberg. I really do appreciate all of their support as well. A quick personal thank you from my side as well to my own team here at Forum Europe, who've been working on the event, and particularly to Anna and to Charlene. There's a huge amount of work that goes into all these events behind the scenes, and both of them have done a fantastic job. So guys, thank you very much to both of you as well. A quick reminder that all of the recordings of the sessions that have been taking place today are available to watch back. So they're going to be sent out. I think they're actually available from the reception area of the platform, but we're going to be sending out an email with the links to all of those. So any sessions that anyone has missed during the day today, you will be able to watch those back again. And yeah, details of how to access those will be sent out to you shortly. We're also going to be putting together a highlights video of the proceedings today and a summary conference report, and those as well are going to be sent out to you very shortly as well. And in return for all these post-event materials, we do just ask you one favor, and that is to fill in our feedback form. So we're really keen to hear how you all felt the event went, what you maybe found most useful, what you think we could possibly improve on. So we have put together a feedback form, and I think my colleague Charlene is going to be posting a link to that in the chat. And again, we'll send that out to you by email as well. So if possible, we do ask you just to take 2 minutes to fill in that form and give us your thoughts on how everything has gone. But it's now my honor to officially close the 19th edition of this year's European Financial Services Conference. This is the second year in a row that this event has been held in a virtual format. And whilst we have hugely enjoyed the experience of doing that, David, as you said earlier, I heartily agree that, and I think everyone else probably will as well, but we really do hope that next year we'll be able to return to an in-person format. And I think particularly so because next year is actually going to be the 20th anniversary of the conference. So I think it would be very fitting if we could all get together and celebrate that properly, with it being that landmark as well. So for now, although this year we can't, again, offer you coffee or a networking lunch as we normally would at this stage, we can offer one last opportunity for all of you to connect with your fellow participants using the networking and the delegate tab that we have available. So the platform is going to be left open for another 30 minutes or so to enable you to do this. So please do take advantage of that and hopefully have the chance to catch up again with each other before we all head off and onto other things. So once again, thank you so much to all of you for your participation. Thank you to all of our partners. David, thank you again for hosting the event in this way. On behalf of everyone involved in the event, we'd like to wish you all a very pleasant rest of the day. Stay safe, and we look forward to hopefully seeing you all again very soon. Thank you very much.